No one ever thought that Rick Harrison, who used to be the man behind the counter appraising high-value antiques, would be found guilty of money laundering, human trafficking, and working with organized crime. He was given a life sentence without the chance of parole, which ended forever the image of a TV mogul who was once seen as the American dream. But if you think the story ends with the verdict, you're wrong. Rick Harrison wasn't sent to a normal prison or work program to try to change his life. Instead, he was sent straight to ADX Florence, which is known as the living hell of the U.S. prison system. This is where the most violent and dangerous prisoners end up, including terrorists, serial killers, and cold-blooded drug lords. Each cell is like a coffin, and Rick Harrison, who used to live in luxury, was thrown into the middle of a den of beasts. What happened to Rick Harrison inside this so-called spiritual graveyard? Why did some of the worst criminals in the country start to hunt him down? Why is life behind that iron door so scary? Let's find out in today's video. 1. The nightmare begins. After more than 8 months of investigations and tense trials, the verdict was final. Rick Harrison, who used to be a reality TV star, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole on charges of large-scale money laundering, supporting transnational human trafficking, and working with an organized crime network. The decision shocked everyone, but for Rick, it wasn't the length of his sentence that shocked him. It was where he would be sent. ADX Florence, Colorado, also known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies, is the most notorious maximum security prison in the U.S., and possibly the harshest in the world. It is far from any town and surrounded by cold desert winds and empty land. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, Ramsey Youssef, the 1993 WTC bomber, El Chapo, the Mexican drug lord, and Richard Reed, the shoe bomber, have all been held there. The walls are made of meters-thick concrete, and prisoners are locked in their cells 23 hours a day. Meals are delivered through a slot in the door, and the exercise yard is just a small metal cage on the roof where prisoners can breathe free air for an hour a day. Rick knew he wasn't like those men. He was the system doesn't care if you're a businessman who went bankrupt or a terrorist. Once you're labeled high risk, you're locked up with the beasts, no matter how many suits you wore or how many interviews you gave on national TV. The day Rick was transferred to ADX Florence, it felt like a movie, but this one didn't have a happy ending. He was led by an armed security guard and chained at the wrists and ankles. When the steel door slammed behind him, he knew he was no longer Rick Harrison and just a case number. Rick, who used to live in a mansion in Las Vegas, drive sports cars, and eat at 5-star restaurants, woke up in a 1x3 6M cell with no windows, no voices, and a low ceiling. The bed was a concrete slab with a thin mattress, and the toilet was joined to a steel sink. The fluorescent light was on all the time, even when he tried to sleep, and the smell of mold mixed with industrial bleach hit him like a punch to the head. It was like living in a giant, damp, suffocating pressure cooker. There was no one to talk to, and only the cold voice of the intercom. Rick screamed on his first day, but no one answered. He pounded on the door and begged for a guard, but all he heard was one sentence over the speaker: "Get used to it." That sentence was the death knell for the world he used to know. Being robbed of everything, from the freedom to choose to the freedom to speak, sent Rick into a mental tailspin. He didn't eat for 2 days, threw up from heat shock, and couldn't sleep every time he closed his eyes. Rick dreamed he was being stripped naked in front of a laughing crowd. Every time he thought about his warm, glowing bedroom in Las Vegas, he felt like he was suffocating. This was now his permanent home, and his body was curled up like he'd been punched in the chest. But what was worse than the cell itself were the neighbors, the invisible men locked just one wall away and buried in ADX with him. They were notorious criminals who had killed dozens, built bombs, and poisoned communities. Rick had only seen them in the news, but he slept just meters away. Every sound, a low, manic laugh, something hitting the wall, or the eerie mumble of someone singing at night made his skin crawl because he didn't know if one of them would one day figure out a way to talk to him through the prison's underground channels. In those first days, Rick learned an unwritten rule that says no one teaches you, but everyone learns in this place. No one helps you unless it's good for them, and if you're the only man in the block with nothing to offer, no one has any power over you. If you don't have any friends or a good reputation, all you have is fear, which makes you an easy target. That's when Rick realized that the worst part of prison isn't the blood, it's the cold stares of men waiting for you to make your first mistake. 2. Rick found himself in the crosshairs of other predators in prison. The strong prey on the weak, and the most hated people are the first to be targeted. Rick Harrison used to be famous, but in the hyper, competitive and violent environment of prison, fame turned into a trap. It made him stand out right away, not as a known person, but as an easy target, a piece of prey that everyone wanted. To experienced inmates who went in and out of prison all the time, Rick was an oddity. He wasn't a street criminal, he didn't come from gangs or the drug world. He came from TV, a world of lights, scripts, and polish. That made him an outsider and also a live bait in prison. Rick fit all three criteria. He was wealthy, well-informed, and easy to take advantage of. Veteran inmates could see that Rick wasn't a celebrity who got caught. He was walking wallet organization bait or worse, someone accused of crimes against human dignity even in prison, which is looked down upon. The human trafficking charges made Rick's situation even more dangerous. According to a 2022 U.S. Department of Justice report, over 40% of violent incidents in prison are caused by inmates judging each other's crimes. As a result of being exposed by the media and widely criticized by the public, Rick had nowhere to hide during his first week in prison. He could feel danger, eyes on him in the cafeteria, casual questions about his charges whispered in passing, and a crude warning scratched into the wall next to his bed. All of these signs pointed to one thing: he was being watched. But the worst part was that he had no idea who was watching or who would attack him in prison. Threats are never direct. People who are weak don't know where their fear is coming from. A hidden cut in the shower, a fall on the metal stairs, or a food tray that wasn't his. Rick started to live on high alert. He ate with his back to the wall, never let himself sleep too deeply, and hid his razor behind his soap so no one could get it. But all of this was just his natural defense because he knew he was at the bottom of the food chain. Violence in prison isn't just stabbing, beating, or killing. It's planned. Rick wasn't part of any of the prison's power structures, racial groups, regional alliances, or underground mafias. He didn't have any street cred, a criminal record, or protection from those in power, so he was easy to shape or pressure into playing their game. A man who used to have millions of dollars in access to lawyers, the press, and media could be a useful tool if used correctly. When Rick refused to play along and be someone's pawn, he was officially labeled a problem. One group sent someone to talk to him about it. Not to directly threaten him, but to show him what would happen if he didn't cooperate. One new prisoner was beaten badly for being too proud, and another was stripped of everything just for not sharing a care package. Rick got the message loud and clear: become a tool or become an example. That's when the sneaky mind games started. A stranger tried to be friendly by starting a conversation and offering to help him with something. An invitation to share a meal, which never happens without strings attached. A folded note was found under his pillow. We know who you are. Every move knew of. Maid was a form of psychological warfare. This is a classic prison strategy. Don't fight back, just sleep deprivation, confusion, and mental erosion. Break the mind and the body will follow. Rick, who used to be the head of a business empire, wasn't naive, but he knew he was already losing. His new enemies weren't customers on camera. They were predators who lived by survival instincts instead of social norms in this jungle. Staying alive didn't depend on charm one night. Rick was attacked in the bathroom. The injuries weren't serious enough to need medical help, but they were enough to send a clear message. There were no accusations, names, or witnesses. Just a bruised face, scraped skin, and a message as sharp as a knife. This is a test, and Rick knew this was only the beginning of 3. The mental prison is the fear without a name in prison. It's not the punches or wounds that break a person. It's the long silence between threats that cuts like a knife. Rick Harrison's time in prison wasn't just a physical battle. It was a long-term captivity in his own mind. Each sleepless night wasn't caused by noise, but by a whisper in his head that today was the last day. The fear here didn't come from a specific person or make itself known. It crept in through the stairs, the heavy silence during meals, slightly misplaced personal items, and footsteps that stopped outside his cell door in the middle of the night. Rick had been in high-stakes negotiations worth millions of dollars before, but nothing had prepared him for how helpless he felt in this situation. In a place where everyone hides their true intentions, it's the unknown that breaks you first. Sleep became harder, and rest came in fits and starts. He was always anxious, waking up at the sound of the tiniest noise or just having the feeling that someone was watching him. Every night, Rick curled up with his back to the wall, trying to protect himself from danger he couldn't see. Being chased all the time, even when no one touched him, gave him the feeling of being hunted that never went away. Time, which Rick used to manage as an asset in business, had turned into an invisible executioner. He had no phone, no work, and no goals. Each day that went over 24 hours felt like a month, and he didn't get any letters or visits. He had no idea what was going on in the outside world. In prison, time doesn't pass, it stays the same, and those who are locked up rot along with it. Like Rick, whose life was always moving, it became a cycle of never-ending stillness, and in that stillness, memories came back like dull blades scraping his mind. He remembered the decisions he made, the shady deals he made, and the times he turned a blind eye to people getting hurt for profit. Images he had pushed aside in pursuit of legacy now came back as an internal trial playing over and over again. No one had to tell him he couldn't forgive himself because he had become the very person he used to pretend he wasn't in prison. Being alone with other people takes a different form. Rick was surrounded by people, but no one he truly trusted, understood, or didn't want something from him. Every conversation had a plan, every word was measured, and every silence was a possible threat. Slowly, Rick became guarded and distant, and he started to wonder if he was losing the ability to communicate at all. His emotions started to change, too. Some days he woke up feeling completely numb, with no fear, hope, or regret. This numbness, which felt like a shield, was actually the first sign of, according to the U.S. National Institute of Mental Health (NIM), when fear doesn't have a name, shape, or effect on your heartbeat, that's when your mind starts to fall apart. This is especially true for people like Rick, who are under a lot of social pressure and guilt. The rate is even higher for those who are dealing with these issues. Some of the most common symptoms are insomnia, paranoia, panic attacks, and severe depression that gets worse over time. Rick started having sudden panic attacks. Sometimes just a strange sound was enough to make him grip the edge of his bed and stare at the cell door. He began to doubt everyone, even the few people who had been kind to him. Was he waiting for something? Had I said too much? These questions kept going through his mind, making it impossible for him to think clearly. Once, Rick sat in silence for hours, unable to remember why he was in prison. This wasn't because he forgot his crimes. His mind had started to disconnect from reality. This is a psychological defense called dissociation, when something is too much for you to handle. That's when he realized he was going into a mental state that no amount of money or fame could save him from. The scariest part of prison wasn't the beatings. It was the slow erasure of the self. Rick didn't know who he was anymore, not a businessman, not a father, not the man from TV. Everything that used to define him had been taken away. All that was left was a shadow, a shell of a man living in fear, doubt, and isolation. What usually happens next is the breakdown of the body. For Rick Harrison, his physical decline didn't come like an open wound. It came slowly, bleeding out through the smallest cracks, eroding his organs, his habits, and every bit of stability that used to hold his identity together. Rick started to feel his body breaking down in the simplest ways: shortness of breath, constant headaches, insomnia, and uncontrollable weight loss. Prison isn't the answer to this problem. The food isn't very good and is mostly starch and low protein. There were no vegetables, so they messed up Rick's digestion. His stomach hurt all the time, but no one bothered to check on it or treat it. The air in the prison was thick, with no ventilation and a strong smell of sweat, detergent, mold, blood, and cheap antibiotics. Rick breathed decay every day, and after just a few months, he got a cough that wouldn't go away. According to a report by the Marshall Project, 36% of federal prisoners have had breathing problems because of dirty cells and polluted air, and most of them never get the care they need. Rick's physical decline wasn't the worst part. His spirit followed. He became emotionally numb and detached from his body. When a man loses hope, he stops caring. He skipped meals and sat still for hours. His skin turned gray and his eyes sunk. He scratched his leg on the edge of his bed frame and got a small cut that turned red and oozed pus for weeks. When he asked for help, the prison clinic gave him a few generic antibiotics. They weren't enough to heal him, but they were enough to keep him from dying. The pain became his normal, no longer sudden or severe, but constant joint aches, numb limbs, and stomach cramps that mixed together into a constant hum inside his body. But what scared him the most wasn't the pain, it was the indifference. In prison, complaining is seen as weak, so Rick learned to endure. He kept quiet, clenched his teeth, and got used to living in a shell that was even worse. His mental health was getting worse every day. He was having more panic attacks, and sometimes the sound of footsteps near his door would make him freeze up for 40 minutes, unable to move, even if it was just someone walking by. Mental illness in prison is a silent epidemic. A 2021 report by the Sentencing Reform Commission found that nearly 1/3 of federal inmates showed signs of mental disorders, but only 12% received any official treatment. Rick wasn't one of those 12%. Among them, he started talking to himself, first in mumblings while sleeping, then in full conversations with people who weren't there. This wasn't an act. It's what happens when you live in a world where no one listens. You go crazy from the silence. Rick started calling his son's name in his sleep. One time he dreamed he was haggling over an antique and woke up sweaty and heart racing like a drum line. He became very sensitive to sounds. A small click made him go crazy. A distant laugh at night could wake him up, and he started to avoid shared areas and spending more time in the bathroom just to avoid eye contact. Every interaction felt empty and dangerous, and Rick's body, which used to look like that of a famous TV personality, no longer held life. He had lost nearly 15 kg in 8 months, and his muscles were gone, leaving him with soft skin and a hunched posture that made him look 10 years older than he really was. But the outside only told part of the story. He had come to accept that. Rick once wrote but never sent a letter in which he said, "I don't think I'm a person anymore. Every morning I ask myself if today is worth trying to survive, and then I live not because I want to, but because I don't know what else to do." At that point, the prison didn't need to torture his body. Rick's mind had already told the guards what to do, and no one but Rick could stop what happened next. 5. When identity doesn't matter anymore, Perhaps the worst thing prison, it's not the chains on your wrists or the cold concrete that hurts, it's how it slowly strips away your identity, the one thing that makes you feel human. Rick Harrison went into prison with the weight of a whole past: businessman, public figure, reality TV star. But after months in jail, he was reduced to a shadow, just a number in the federal inmate system. From the first day he was locked up, guards stopped calling him by name and instead used his ID number in mate #90476-173. Losing your name is the most basic way of denying that you exist as a person. It turns someone with a story, a personality, and a history into an anonymous being that can only be controlled. No one asked him how he was feeling, no one brought up who he used to be, and slowly, Rick stopped bringing it up himself. The pain didn't explode, it built up like a small wound that never heals. When no one said Rick Harrison, the memory of that man began to fade. Roll calls, cell searches, and staff interviews all reminded him that he was just a man. Eventually, he stopped trying to prove who he was and started to let go of his name, image, and legacy. They all felt like frills that didn't fit into this harsh reality. What's worse, the silence made him start to question his own memories. Was I really successful? Were those golden years real or just something I made up when I was falling apart? Someone doesn't lose their identity because it's erased from the system. They lose it when they stop believing in who they used to be, Rick started to say. In his dreams, he wasn't standing behind the counter negotiating antiques. Instead, he was wearing silver prison clothes and sitting on a steel bench, his eyes hollow. In prison, no one listens to your voice, opinions, explanations, or objections. They are all seen as non-compliance. Rick once complained that he was being held in solitary confinement longer than the law allowed. He filed a complaint and asked for a hearing, but was called disruptive. After a few more attempts, he realized that speaking up only made things worse, so he stopped speaking up at first selectively and then completely. He didn't argue about anything about himself, and over time, even his inner voice became quieter. Losing the power to be heard and believed is losing the power to shape reality. When no one asks, listens, or cares about what you have to say, you start to question the value of language itself. Rick's voice used to be influential. It could be heard on millions of TV, but now no one needed it. His words, whether they were reasonable or desperate, were ignored when he was locked in with a group of angry inmates. Explain that he wasn't involved in a fight, and the response was, "You talk too much, faker." After that, he learned to keep quiet, but his loss of self-worth wasn't just caused by how other people treated him, it started from the inside out. Rick started telling himself lies to get through prison. I don't need anyone, I deserve this, there's nothing left but to endure. These mantras didn't make him feel better, but they helped him stay alive. Lying to yourself isn't deception, it's survival, and when repeated long enough, even lies start to make sense. Rick just nodded and walked away when he heard that another prisoner had killed himself. He wasn't indifferent, he didn't know how to feel anymore. He was frozen in joy, fear, anger, and sadness, and no one cared, so he stopped acting emotionally. Being emotionally numb wasn't a choice. It was the slow wearing down of a man in a place where emotions are seen as weakness. Over time, he changed into a different person, with no face, voice, or clear memories. Motions wake up, eat, work, sleep. At this point, Rick Harrison from Pawn Stars was just a vague presence living among a mass of people who'd also forgotten who they used to be. What was scariest wasn't that other people had forgotten who they were. It was that he had forgotten who he was himself. 6. The price of fame in the free world. Fame had propelled Rick Harrison further than any other antique dealer. It opened doors that money alone couldn't buy. It led to national TV appearances and devoted fans in prison. Rick's fame wasn't a shield. It was a bright red target on his back that drew every eye, not in admiration but in anticipation. The fame he once owned, once took pride in, once used to his advantage had turned into a curse. Every other inmate knew his name, but that didn't get him better food, a cleaner blanket, or any extra attention from them. Instead, it meant they were watching him more closely, analyzing every move, every look, and every word. One inmate said to him behind his back, "There's no way a famous guy isn't hiding something." In a prison where everyone is suspicious, the name Rick Harrison carried more weight than any sentence. Rick's past couldn't be buried in prison. It was brought up every day to torture him. The articles and TV reports that once showed every dark side of his careering, including money laundering, drug trafficking, and ties to organized crime, were no longer rumors. They were a social sentence with no appeals. It didn't matter as much as what the crowd thought, and in this case, people thought Rick was the perfect example of a con artist, a fox dressed as a merchant. The sins he used to try to hide or explain away were now slogans others used to step on him. Fellow inmates, many of whom had never even seen an episode of Pawn Stars, used his past as a weapon. "Hey, billionaire," someone sneered as Rick swept the bathroom floor, "you really trafficked people. Tell us how old those kids were." Someone else said these accusations out loud at lunch to make sure everyone heard them. They didn't need proof, just repetition, and they quickly became prison truth. The bitter truth was that no one cared what was real. Rick might not be guilty of all charges, or the media could have gotten it wrong. But in the closed, hostile world of prison, truth matters less than emotion. People were jealous of a man who used to have everything and was now being put down and picked apart for sport. His public image died not in the press, but when people used it to make themselves feel better. Rick tried to defend himself and explain that there were misunderstandings, but all he got in prison was blank stares. No one wants to hear a former star talk about justice to them. Rick stood for the system that had abandoned them, a society that worshipped money and let lying happen. When he was arrested, some people even called it late justice. And they didn't want to miss the chance to land a few symbolic blows. Every day, Rick had to live in a world where his former image was being killed off piece by piece. Whispers about his TV days turned into jokes, and you could no longer trade $5,000 watch for a pack of cigarettes. The mockery, which was sometimes subtle and sometimes blunt, was meant to crush any hope that he was still someone special. Even the guards joined in. Some would use, others would sneer and say things like, "Hey TV star, make sure the floor is clean," during cell checks. No one said it outright, but it was clear that Rick was treated worse than everyone else. Not because his crimes were worse, but because he had lived a better life than everyone else. This shows a harsh rule in prison. The past is never forgiven. It's dragged out, torn apart, and used against the person who once owned it. Rick Harrison wasn't just paying for what he had done, he was paying for who he had become. In his darkest hours, Rick didn't pray for freedom. He prayed for a reason to wake up without hopelessness. But prison doesn't offer many of those things. No more visits, letters, or voices from the outside world. Maybe the world had forgotten about him, or worse, only remembered him for the bad things. Rick stopped telling himself, "Things will get better." He started to think, "Maybe I deserve it if things get worse." The prolonged isolation pushed him past anxiety and into deep depression. He stopped reacting to outside news. When a guard told him that one of his former friends had received an additional sentence, Rick just shrugged, not because he didn't care, but because he no longer felt anything in prison. He was alive, but not living. When he looked in the mirror, the face staring back at him was unfamiliar, not because it was old, but because it held no recognizable emotion. When life loses meaning, people start to think about death. Rick did the same thing one day. He sat on the edge of his bunk for almost 4 hours, thinking about what would happen if he just disappeared. He thought that maybe no one would notice right away, or if they did, It would only be a short conversation at lunch, and then life would go on. The death of a famous person wasn't shocking anymore. It was just another line in a federal prisoner report. Rick never actually tried to kill himself, but he didn't fight the thought. Whenever he walked past the second-floor railing, washed a plastic knife in the kitchen, or took a headache pill, he thought, "What if I just?" The thoughts weren't very specific, but they happened more often, which was the clearest sign that he no longer thought life was worth living. When someone stops being afraid of death, it's not courage. It means life has stopped giving them anything to lose. When someone is pushed to the very bottom of suffering, two things can happen. They either break completely or they start seeing things they hadn't dared to see before. For Rick Harrison, after months of spiritual death and darkness, something started to shift. He stopped resisting and he stopped denying. That was the start of what some would call an awakening. At first, it was something as simple as a passing comment from another prisoner in the yard or a random page turned in the prison library. Then, slowly, memories of guilt and regret began to come together, and Rick realized what he'd done. The shady deals, silent nods, and times he pretended not to see weren't just business moves, they were knives he'd helped wield. The torment became clear not because he was being punished, but because for the first time there was no one left to defend him. No lawyer, no fans, no cameras. Just Rick looking at himself in the mirror and asking, "Am I a bad person?" That's when he started to read things other than business books and self-help books. He didn't read biographies, but books about philosophy, ethics, guilt, and forgiveness. He read Dostoevsky, Viktor Frankl, the Bible, and meditation books. He didn't read for fun. He read to ask himself, is it still possible for someone who's done so much wrong to live the rest of their life as a decent human being? He also started writing, first just a few lines in a journal and then longer pieces that told his life not through a TV lens but honestly. He wrote about his mistakes, how he was too afraid to act when he should have. He wrote to remember, to take responsibility and not to get freedom. What he really wanted was forgiveness from others, especially the people he and the system he worked for had hurt, but most importantly from himself. He used to think his decisions were just for business or the greater good, but now he saw that as an excuse. Forgiving yourself isn't about erasing the past. It's about having the courage to face it without looking away. That's why he started writing letters that weren't addressed to anyone. He wrote in the drawer of his cell, "I know I've hurt people. I can't ask them to forget, but if they could see the regret in me, maybe they'd believe I'm not the man they once hated." Can Rick truly redeem himself? There's no clear answer. Some mistakes are too big to undo and some wounds will never heal. But by thinking about all the bad things he had done, Rick realized that redemption isn't always about being forgiven. Sometimes it's just about never doing harm again. If he still had one last wish, it wasn't to get out of prison. Not because he no longer wanted freedom, but because he knew what he needed more was peace. Whether he was in a small cell or nearing the end of his life, all he wanted was to sleep one night without nightmares, knowing that even though he had done wrong, he didn't die numb to it. Rick Harrison used to have it all: wealth, fame, power, and the belief that he was living the right way. Millions of people looked up to Rick as the embodiment of the American dream, a man of sharp wit and success. But one day it all fell apart, not because someone betrayed him, but because the truth could no longer be hidden. When the prison door slammed shut, Rick stepped into a different world where nothing that he had used to define himself meant anything. Prison didn't just take Rick's freedom, it crushed every illusion and left him a raw, fragile person haunted by his own past. The walls the chains didn't hurt Rick because he had to face the version of himself he had long avoided, the one he hid behind polished sound bites and media appearances. Rick Harrison's story is a brutal reminder that no one is special in prison. Fame won't save you from guilt, the past can't be erased, and the truth is always waiting to be dragged out in the cold light of isolation. Maybe he's still alive, but he really, if you agree, leave a comment below, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more shocking truths in the next movie. This isn't the end.